Good evening, everyone. I'm Catherine Allgore, the president of the Massachusetts Historical Society, and I am delighted to welcome such a large crowd to the next in our series, Confronting Racial Injustice. The discussion tonight will explore the war on drugs in Massachusetts, the racial impact of the school zone law, and other mandatory minimum sentences. We're very pleased to be partnering with the Northeastern School of Law's Criminal Justice Task Force to host this series, and specifically would like to thank Barbara Berenson and Barbara George Okara for their role in leading this effort and bringing together an incredible team of people who have worked on the series. I would also like to thank the 28 other organizations who have helped us promote these programs. They have been a great success, and we appreciate the support of other institutions in bringing together a wide and diverse audience. With such a broad reach, I'm sure that the crowd tonight includes some who may be interacting with MHS for the very first time. So briefly, just to let you know who we are, the Massachusetts Historical Society is the first historical society in America. We were founded in 1791 and have been an independent nonprofit institution dedicated to collecting, preserving, publishing, and sharing our state and our nation's history for the past 230 years. And we host events like this 2 or 3 times a week. I hope you will visit our website at masshist.org and check out the other events we have coming up. The topics we are discussing tonight are difficult for some and painful for others. But we deeply believe that it is important to look at all of the history of Massachusetts. We are proud to see that this series, which explores some stories that force us to question our assumptions, have been some of the most popular events we have hosted in years. We are glad to be learning and processing these stories with our audiences, and we look forward to continuing these dialogues. Now, I am happy to turn the program over to Barbara Berenson. Ms. Berenson has served as a senior attorney at the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court for 15 years. Prior to that, she worked as an assistant attorney general in Massachusetts and an assistant district attorney in Middlesex County. She is now a lecturer at Harvard Law School. Barbara.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and good evening to all of you. On behalf of the Northeastern University School of Law's Criminal Justice Task Force, I'm delighted to welcome you to the 4th panel discussion in the Confronting Racial Injustice series. The Confronting Racial Injustice series endeavors to shine a light on structural racism's beginnings, earlier expressions, and contemporary manifestations. Our aim is to examine the legacy of slavery and see how its shadow has diminished the financial prospects, educational access, and the freedoms of residents in our Black and Brown communities. In our first panel, we examined the connection between slavery and intergenerational wealth. Panels 2 and 3 considered segregation and discrimination in the housing market and in education. Today, we turn to the war on drugs to explore the racial impact of the school zone law and other mandatory minimum sentences. I am now honored to introduce our panel moderator, the Honorable Sidney Hanlon. Justice Hanlon has served on the Massachusetts Appeals Court since 2009. Prior to that, she served for 20 years as a justice and later first justice of the Dorchester District Court. A graduate of Brown University and Harvard Law School, Justice Hanlon began her legal career as an assistant district attorney in Norfolk County and later served as an assistant U.S. attorney in the District of Massachusetts and as an assistant attorney general for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Justice Hanlon's long list of leadership activities includes her past service as chair of the District Court's Domestic Violence Committee. She has also traveled extensively to other nations to lead programs for judges on the rule of law. Welcome, Justice Hanlon.
Thank you very much, Barbara. It's a great privilege to be part of this discussion, and especially with this panel, I have to tell you all. You're going to hear from 4 panelists tonight, and I'm going to tell you their names and introduce them briefly now, and I'll tell you a little bit more about them as we call on them one at a time. First, Professor Deborah Ramirez, who's a criminal law professor at the Northeastern University School of Law. Second will be Mr. Abrigal Forrester. who's the executive director of the Teen Empowerment Program in Boston and Somerville. Rahsaan Hall is the director of the Racial Justice Program at the American Civil Liberties Union. And Senator William Brownsberger is the president pro tem of the Senate, the Massachusetts Senate, and recent chair of the Massachusetts Senate Judiciary Committee. As we begin, we've all agreed that I'm going to give you a very brief history lesson to set the stage. And I'm also going to define some terms that I hope you'll find useful. One important term that you will hear over and over again tonight is mandatory minimum sentence. Up until the 1980s, most people who were sentenced to prison or jail in Massachusetts were eligible for parole after serving a fraction of the lower number of the sentence. So it was a 6 to 9 year sentence. People were eligible after serving perhaps a third of that sentence, a half of that sentence, 2/3 of the sentence, or even with a certain type of sentence, 1/10 of that sentence, depended on the institution and the court, but small percentages, relatively small percentages. There were some exceptions. There was, in 1975, the legislature enacted a mandatory minimum sentence for carrying a firearm of 1 year in the House of Correction. The mandatory sentence for first-degree murder was life without the possibility of parole. And for second-degree murder was a sentence of a minimum mandatory of 15 years. But these were really the exceptions in criminal sentencing in Massachusetts in the 1980s. So now for the history part. Beginning in the early 1980s, law enforcement priorities shifted significantly, both at the national level and also at the state level, in order to address what was perceived as a growing issue of illegal drug distribution. And this shift coincided with what was, in fact, a dramatic increase in the use of both powder and crack cocaine, as opposed to drugs that people had been using before the 80s in larger numbers: heroin, marijuana, and manufactured drugs, including methamphetamine. And at the same time, violence, particularly street violence, was in fact increasing appreciably. So as a result, law enforcement agencies at both the state and the federal levels, they really increased their staffs, and they drastically increased their efforts in the area of drug enforcement. And the legislature also drastically increased prison sentences for drug sellers, or traffickers, as they were coming to be known. And the new laws provided for what I've told you were mandatory minimum sentences for those crimes. Those mandatory minimums didn't apply to simple possession for personal use, not to possession at all, unless the prosecutor could prove that the person intended to distribute it further. But for distribution, for possession with intent to distribute, the sentences were significant. And those sentences were based solely on the amount of powder or drug seized, without regard to the role of the person in the transaction. Maybe that person was the driver, maybe they were the person who handed the drugs over, maybe they were the person who sent everybody out from some other place. Same sentence, all determined completely on the amount of the powder. So for example, in 1988, the legislature passed and Governor Dukakis signed a law that for 14 grams, and for those of you who don't think in metric, that's approximately half an ounce, the mandatory minimum sentence was 3 years in the House of Correction, or 3 years in state prison, actually. And the sentences grew, escalated as the amount of powder grew, until for half a pound of cocaine, or 200 grams, the mandatory minimum sentence was 15 years in the state prison, which, as I've told you, is the same as the sentence for second-degree murder. And then in 1989, the law changed again, providing that if any distribution or possession with intent offenses occurred within 1,000 feet of a school, there was a mandatory minimum sentence of at least 2 years in the House of Correction. And that was true regardless of whether school was in session regardless of whether you lived within 1,000 feet of a school and you were selling within your house, the school zone law applied. And I think it's fair to say that for the most part, those sentences were significantly greater, many times greater than the kinds of sentences that courts were giving to people who were convicted of other kinds of crimes. For example, breaking and entering, or domestic violence, certainly, or even shootings. And if the prosecutor proved the crime, or if there was a plea that the crime is charged, the judge had no flexibility at all about the minimum mandatory amount of the sentence. So the discretion really was shifted in significant part to prosecutors, and also, as we'll see, also to police officers. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. I think it's interesting to note that of the people from whom you'll be hearing, 3 of the panelists, and as you've heard about me, are all former drug prosecutors, just to give a perspective. So our first panelist is Professor Deborah Ramirez. As I've told you, she's a criminal law professor at the Northeastern University School of Law. She's an expert in criminal justice, and especially in racial issues in criminal justice and how they affect law enforcement and what kinds of reforms are possible and necessary. She is the founder of Northeastern's Criminal Justice Task Force and the chief inspiration for, one might say, instigator of this entire series of discussions, for which we are very grateful. And she's also a former assistant United States attorney and a former drug prosecutor. Professor Ramirez, I understand that in the 1990s, you and Jack McDevitt, also from Northeastern, conducted some research into the effect of these sentences in the 1990s and how race affected them. And so would you tell us a little bit about what you learned, please?
Okay, well, it was almost 20 years ago. And at that time, Justice Hanlon was the chief of the Dorchester District Court. And we were discussing racial disparities. And she told me that she saw a difference in the way that Black, Latino, and white drug traffickers were being brought to justice. Now, she said, you know, I am a short order cook in one courthouse, and I'm not keeping numbers. But here's what I'm seeing, that the white defendants, particularly from the suburbs, for small quantities of narcotics, were being charged with possession of drugs, but not distribution. And the prosecutor was recommending continuance without a finding, which meant a kind of probation. And if no further crimes were committed, the defendant would have no criminal record. Meanwhile, for the exact same conduct and the same quantity of narcotics, the neighborhood Black and Latino defendants were being charged with possession with intent to distribute or distributing narcotics, which allowed the prosecutors to charge the minimum mandatory sentence, which at the time was 2 years. And almost everyone in Dorchester was within a school zone and thus could be eligible for the 2-year minimum mandatory. Now, this troubled her, but it also troubled a lot of the other judges because they felt that the prosecutors were charging mandatory minimum school zone offenses, which prevented the judges from having any power or authority to ensure fairness in sentencing or evidence-based sentencing. So we decided to investigate. We decided to look at who was getting charged in Dorchester District Court with the mandatory minimum offenses. We began with what we knew. And here's what we knew. We knew that in Massachusetts, for 12 years in a row, 75% of all persons convicted of drug offenses with minimum mandatory sentences were persons of color, 75%. And the research question was this. People were asking, did that disparity represent a disparity that could be explained if you looked at differences in criminal behavior, the role in the offense, the quantity or quality of drugs, or the prior criminal history? And what stood out was this. At the end of the study, we learned that for the same behavior and the same quantities and type of drugs, 52% of Blacks and Latinos who were arrested were charged with the mandatory minimum, as opposed to 15% of whites. Now, those disparities remained even when we put in key variables like role in the offense, type of narcotics, quantity of narcotics, and prior criminal history. And there was another very startling fact that emerged. We looked at all of the police reports for each of the cases that we investigated. Half of the whites who were described by the police in the police report as the sellers of drugs, half of them were charged with simple possession, not distribution, not possession with intent to distribute, and therefore were not eligible to be charged with the minimum mandatory. In contrast, 93% of the non-white people who the police designated as sellers were charged with distribution and thus eligible for the minimum mandatory offense. And we did, with the help of Jack McDevitt and others, a multivariable regression analysis after meeting with prosecutors and police and asking them for all the factors that might explain this disparity. And in the end, we were unable to find a legitimate non-racial explanation for these disparities. And when we asked police and prosecutors how they decided what charge to level against a suspect, they told us the same thing over and over again. It has to do with whether it's a good kid or a bad kid.
So what would you say, Professor, were the training or policy implications that you as professionals took from that research?
Well, it's interesting because I began the study by thinking that it was about implicit negative bias that was causing Blacks and Latinos to be sentenced more harshly. I thought of implicit bias as sort of unconscious negative stereotypes, and those were what was affecting the charging decisions. But in fact, the study indicated that it was more like affinity bias or white tribalism. The police and prosecutors were giving breaks and second chances to white defendants, even if they were designated as the sellers. And they felt that those people were worthy of redemption. So I think we need to make police and prosecutors aware that though they believe they're doing a good thing because they think this is a good person who made a mistake, and they don't want to put them through the harsh consequences of the criminal justice system, they're really perpetuating racial disparities by endowing members of their tribe with positive attributes and at the same time dehumanizing others who they deem less worthy of second chances and redemption.
So this, as I recall, is a little more than 20 years ago. And we would have all hoped we've learned something in the meantime. And has any research been done more recently on this issue in the Massachusetts court system?
Well, yes, there's the Harvard Law School study that was done recently, within the last few months. It came out this summer. And again, that study began with what we knew. Okay, what do we know today about disparities? We know that Black people in Massachusetts are imprisoned at 8 times that of white people. And we know that Latinx people are imprisoned at nearly 5 times the rate of white people. And we know how we rank nationally in terms of disparities. How are we doing? Well, we have the dubious distinction of ranking highest in the country in terms of Latinx disparities and 13th in terms of Black disparities. So before he died, my husband, Ralph Gantz, then the Chief Justice of the Supreme Judicial Court, asked Harvard Law School to investigate the reasons for these racial disparities. He said, and this is a quote, "We need to learn the truth behind these troubling disparities. And once we learn it, we need the courage and the commitment to handle the truth." The key finding in that report took 4 years for them to analyze all of the cases. The key finding was that harsh initial prosecutorial decisions, including charging mandatory minimums, account for over 70% of the disparities in sentence lengths. Their evidence reveals that Black and Latinx defendants receive more severe initial charges than their white counterparts for similar conduct. And those initial charging decisions set the baseline in plea negotiations and contribute to sentencing disparities.
So that even if the prosecutor is willing to drop the main charge, as long as the person would plead to some lesser amount of time, you're most more likely to get a committed sentence. Is that a fair description of what you said?
Because the initial decision is so harsh, like charging a mandatory minimum, that they're going to plead down to something more than their white counterpart who wasn't initially charged with the mandatory minimum.
All right. And we're going to come back to you about what you see going forward for reform, but I'm going to move on just for now and introduce Mr. Forrester. Abigail Forrester is the executive director of the Teen Empowerment Organization. It works in Boston and Somerville in Massachusetts and also in Rochester, New York, supporting young people from ages 14 to 20 and empowering them to act as catalysts for social change in their communities. And each year, Teen Empowerment employs more than 120 young people who conduct over, I've got this from your website, Mr. Forrester, 250 initiatives that involve more than 5,000 youth, residents, public officials, and police in efforts to build peace, tolerance, and community. Mr. Forrester also earlier directed community programs for the Madison Park Development Corporation, a Roxbury nonprofit that builds affordable housing. And he also served 10 years and a day for a drug sale in 1990 to an undercover DEA agent. Yes. It was his first offense. Mr. Forrester, at the time that you were charged with the drug crime that sent you to prison, how old were you, sir, and what was going on in your life?
Yeah, I was 20 years old, going on 21. Was just having my first, actually had my first child, who was 5 months old when I left to serve a 10-year mandatory minimum sentence, and had just actually moved a little bit outside of the town to Randolph, which I grew up in Dorchester, which is in the Carmen Square area, which was known as in the early, I think it was the late 90s or early 2000s as the Death Corridor, that Talbot Ave area there. But yeah, grew up in that cesspool of that environment of, you know, during the time where the crack epidemic really hit. I was in my teenage years and was really looking to transition out of, like, you know, a lifestyle that I got sucked into at one point. But but that was like my circumstances when I ended up meeting the DEA agent through another gentleman, where I was trying to get rid of a vehicle that I had on the Norwood Auto Mile. And this gentleman identified me because he knew me from the neighborhood. He was also white, and he was going through some things, I guess, and really kept beckoning me to try to get some drugs for him, and then introduced me to this gentleman. Come to find out, he was in a situation, the guy at the car dealer, and introduced me to the DEA agent. And I ended up receiving a 10-year mandatory minimum sentence. But it's actually was 16 years because I had 2 sentences ran concurrent.
All right. And so you went in at age 20, is my understanding.
Yes, yes. And I was arrested by the federal. Listening to the presentation earlier was just really startling to me, because, you know, my case had a couple of dynamics. One is I was arrested by by DEA, taken to the Kennedy building downtown when I was initially arrested, would not cooperate and become an informant, which is what they were trying to force me to do. And then was bounded over to the state immediately because I wouldn't become an informant. And in the state, they had mandatory minimums already implemented. So I was going to be facing those maximum terms of sentencing. But if I would have went to the feds, I would have been facing 3 years, 8 months, because the federal system still had a point system. And because I was a first-time offender with no priors, I would have probably received the lowest amount of sentencing, which would have been 3 years, 8 months.
Especially if you cooperated and you gave up somebody else, essentially, right?
Yeah, and that's, I mean, really the reason why I was bounded over was because I wouldn't cooperate, one, and two, I wasn't even offered any plea. So I went all the way to trial because they felt like, because I wasn't cooperating, I wasn't even offered a plea bargain.
Okay. I'm going to ask you, tell us something, if you would, however much you feel comfortable saying, about your experience of serving that amount of time in prison, starting when you were 20 years old.
Yeah, no, I mean, you know, as someone who was a first-time offender, I had not even done any sort of juvenile detention. It was my first time being incarcerated. I had no familiarity with incarceration. I mean, it was like, you know, I always tell people about compound trauma. You know, trauma in itself leads people to committing crimes, et cetera, inclusive of poverty and broken homes, et cetera. But then you'd end up, you know, in the judicial system and ended up incarcerated for these long periods of times. And it's another compound trauma because of the amount of time that you're going to do. And secondly, like just going in a system that you have no familiarity with. That time, you know, when you entered into the Department of Corrections, you went straight to Walpole. And so like you are really thrust into an environment with some of the most at risk and difficult people, and you have no understanding of how you're going to navigate that climate. Interestingly enough, really quickly, a friend of mine, we were talking about the truth in sentencing era and the mandatory minimum era, because we both had done time under those circumstances. We were talking about when we were young and how, you know, I lived right next to Dorchester Courthouse, and we talked a little bit about how, you know, we had friends who went away to like juvenile detention and they did like 6 months, and we were like, felt like they were gone forever. And so we started talking about what it felt like to be to actually end up incarcerated and doing a decade away from society and our families.
Yeah. How did you spend that time? What did you do with your time when you were there? I understand you've got somebody else competing for your attention.
Sorry, it's just one of those days. I apologize.
It's the fact of Zoom life. Don't apologize.
Yes, it is, and it's an asynchronatic day for school. So it's been all day my trauma going back into sort of facilitating my son, who's the youngest here. But can you give me 1 second? I apologize. I just need to plug up this cord.
You absolutely take your time. We're going to ask Mr. Forrester something about his experience of serving that amount of time, and then also a little bit about what he has done since then.
Yeah, so so I spent my time really focused on self-discovery. You know, from the door, I really took responsibility for the fact that I was there because of decisions I made. which I thought was very helpful to my own transition and transformation. Although I was very aware of the disparities, not in the deep sense that was just presented, but was really familiar with the fact that like there were disparities in in the amount of time that like we were receiving. I mean, just going into the system and hearing conversations even with other inmates who were white, who were incarcerated, who were caught and convicted for crimes that were more serious, one, but also with amounts of drugs that were at a higher level. And they were talking about that they were doing like 18 months. They were doing like 3 years. It was just like, wait a minute, you got caught with 2 kilos and you're doing 3 years. And like, you know, I have friends who did the 15-year mandatory minimum, you know. So it was just, you know, a tragic experience, but really trying to transform and understand more about the system and myself. In 1996, I think it was 96 or 95, I was actually in a Globe Spotlight series about mandatory minimums and showing the disparities of how there were these high trafficking sort of, you know, white dealers who like received sometimes no time. They forfeited property and things of that sort and did no time. And how there were a lot of Black and brown young men from my community, quite frankly, that were facing 10 to 15 years, even sometimes life for substances. So
go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I was going to say coming to terms with that was a challenge in itself.
You made something productive out of that, so I understand. Not out of the prison time so much, but out of your time while you were there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that everyone, you know, one thing that I learned is that everyone has different levels of resilience and you know, what they, the values that they sort of are embedded in them. And so I really started to reach back and take a look at my own experiences of why did this kid, because pretty much I was like, you know, from 1st to 5th grade, I was an honor roll student. You know, I was ranked in tennis at the age of 7. And I wanted to understand how did I, this kid who was so smart, ranked in tennis, I passed to go to exam school. I went to Boston Latin Academy, even though I was put out of there after a time. That was a whole nother issue of rebelling against my father, who really wasn't present. But like, I knew I was a smart kid and I wanted to understand how did this smart kid end up, you know, in the lifestyle that I was in, but now ended up incarcerated, facing 10 years in prison. And what really was the highlight was my own traumatic experiences that I hadn't come to terms with. There was no space for me to really unpack my own trauma, you know, from being in a single parent home, growing up in a community that was poverty stricken, you know, dealing with the back end of busing where, you know, I went to an elementary school literally on the other side of the tracks, which was in Dorchester. And every time we left school, they had to create gauntlets. People were out there with dogs and trying to spit on us. And that was traumatic. And then going to a middle school that I consider to be a Lean On Me middle school, which was one of the 3 toughest middle schools in the city, and dealing with people who looked like me that was a social threat. And so all of these traumas and anxiety riddled experiences that I had really forced me into a position where surviving was more important than academics and education. But at the end of the day, again, none of that was considered in looking at who I was in the totality of a young person when the sentencing came around.
But in prison, you went back to school.
I did. I went back to school, though I have 2 degrees right now, and I'm two classes away from completing my master's at Tufts University. But all of those degrees were acquired on the outside. But I started school on the inside. I did. But that wasn't my focus, to be honest with you. My focus was really understanding that I watch men who are incarcerated leave with 2 degrees and come back in 6 months because of the lack of really an identity with self, and really the internal work that needed to deal with and address the trauma that we all dealt with, one, prior to being incarcerated and then during incarceration. And so most of my work during my time in being incarcerated was really about identifying with self and dealing with my own psychosis and supporting others who were committed to that transformative process.
So when you first came out, what did you do to keep from being one of those people?
Well, I mean, you know, I always called myself a social scientist while I was incarcerated, because a lot of guys would like sort of shun the guys who came back, but I would sit down and have conversations and we'd try to understand like what happened, you know. And there were a series of things that people talked about, whether it was going home and thinking that they were gonna be in a relationship with their child and the woman that they came home to, only to find out that that person had moved on and got into conflict, whether it was responsibilities that they had that they couldn't meet. The other thing that I think that was a disparity was you had tons of men who were leaving prison at the time that were still being charged with child support fees and coming home to $80,000 worth in child support that they needed to pay back to the state. I mean, it was just all this compound issues that people just could not get a grasp on, and ended up going back, not to even speak about the probation and parole system and how, it was luck of the draw on who you got for a probation officer or parole officer that would send a guy back for a beer can in their trash, all of these different issues. So I began to early in my case, begin to think about what would be my strategies around really avoiding some of those sticky situations. And I'd be remiss if I don't mention the fact that I was fortunate to come home to a family who had a space for me and received me and didn't have to, figure out how to put a roof over my head, which was numero uno. And one of the big issues that led people back, to recidivize, because they had to compromise themselves, their values in so many ways just to have a roof over their head. So I had some things in place that worked for me, that helped me sort of get on the right track.
I'm just going to ask you, because I'm going to move only because I think I told you before, we could talk the whole hour, and I would think people would be like to hear what you have to say, but we do have two more speakers. Just tell us a little bit about your program now, if you would, please, about the Teen Empowerment Program and the work that you're doing now.
Yeah, so currently I'm the executive director for the Center for Teen Empowerment. I've been, from my second year home, I've been in the nonprofit industry, and this is my first executive director role. But I feel like this work that I'm doing at Center for Teen Empowerment is like a well-tailored suit for my entire experience, because it is about having young people, seeing young people as assets, and solution drivers and strategy thinkers around the issues that we face in our communities, but also first and foremost, helping them think about what they're thinking about around their own values and beliefs, and unpack the trauma that they're dealing with day to day, by engaging some of these systems being like law enforcement in the community, education systems that are leaving them behind, and putting them in a space where they can start to think about, in a critical way, what are some of the underlying sort of gaps in these systems that need to be addressed, and how do they think about bringing their voice and informing the community at large about the sort of undertones and things that most people don't really recognize that are the core issues around some of these problems that we're facing and trying to solve in society. And so at the Center for Teen Empowerment, we focus on building that capacity for young folks, creating advocates and organizers out of those young folks, and then having them lead the way while the adults in the institution that I work for pulls up the rear. So one quick example of that was last year, May 30th, the biggest rally in March with 40,000 people that was led by Teen Empowerment, young people, and other youth organizers in a peaceful way to address the issues around social justice.
All right, we're going to come back to you. I'm going to introduce Mr. Hall at this point, and we're going to come back to you to talk about going forward. Rahsaan Hall, good evening. Mr. Hall is the director of the Racial Justice Program at the American Civil Liberties Union. His job is to help develop that organization's integrated advocacy approach to address racial justice issues. He's also, in the past, was the deputy director for the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Economic Justice. He was a campaign manager for a program, interesting program called What a Difference a DA Makes, seeking to highlight the role that prosecutors play, especially in Massachusetts, in criminal justice and racial justice issues. In a prior life, between 2000 and 2008, he was an assistant district attorney in Suffolk County in Boston, assigned to prosecute gangs, homicide, and also drug cases. Mr. Hall is also an ordained minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. So, Mr. Hall, what was it like to be a prosecutor between 2000 and 2008, and especially to prosecute drug cases? And what did you think you were doing then, and what did you think about what was going on around you?
those were interesting times. And it's interesting that you asked me because going into it, it was probably the last place that I thought I would be. When I was a law student at Northeastern, where Deborah Ramirez was my criminal law professor, I had a very different perspective on the criminal legal system. I thought I was going to be the next Johnny Cochran. Because we were in law school at the time of the O.J. Simpson trial. And I said,
you were good enough to be. I remember you from those days. You were good enough to be.
Well, thank you. And, you know, my first job out of law school was the public defender's office down in Dade County, Florida. But I came back to Boston and was looking for work. And there was an opportunity at the Suffolk County DA's office under then District Attorney Ralph Martin. And one of the concerns I expressed to him, and I think this gets to the point of your question, was I couldn't see myself as a Black man in a position where I'm sending other Black and brown men to jail or to prison. And Ralph Martin, who I was speaking with, said, I understand that, but you also should recognize that the people in the communities who are the victims of crime or living in communities that are beset by violence and disruption deserve to have your representation in the courtroom as well. And so, you know, with that perspective, I believed that when I was there in front of you in Dorchester District Court handling cases out of Grove Hall, I felt like I was, in the Bowdoin, Geneva area, I felt like I was engaging with the community around a public safety agenda. And I felt like the work that I was doing was trying to keep the community safe, was trying to address the disruption in the community. And the way that I learned about prosecution was from other people who were, you know, senior to me, but there was no training that I went through. And so the things that I learned, particularly as it relates to drug cases and mandatory minimums, was how to leverage those mandatory minimums so that we can get something, even if there were some questions around our case, even if the stop was suspect and we might lose on the motion to suppress. Because I have that mandatory minimum sentence, I have a lot of leverage, and a lot of people don't want to roll the dice and maybe lose that motion to suppress, and maybe take it to trial and then definitely lose and then face a mandatory minimum sentence. And so leveraging those mandatory minimum sentences to offer to break them down and give someone a lesser sentence with the idea that if we can get hooks into a person by having them on probation or having them on a suspended sentence, we can pull them back in. There's one case that stands out in particular. There was this young kid, Black kid, 18 years old, no prior record, was in the park with some weed in his pocket, some marijuana, and it was packaged in a way that suggested that he had an intent to distribute it. And they charged him with possession of a Class D substance with the intent to distribute within a school or a park zone, which carried that mandatory minimum. And the offer that I made was a 2-year sentence suspended for 2 years if he took the plea. So he wouldn't have to do the mandatory minimum, but he would have this 2-year sentence hanging over his head. And his mother said, absolutely, we'll take it, because for her, that meant her son wasn't going to jail that day. And now here we are sitting at in Massachusetts, where there is this robust cannabis industry, and the people who are benefiting the most from that look nothing like that 18-year-old boy I prosecuted, and I have no idea what happened to him over that period of 2 years, whether he successfully completed that probation, whether he had a probation officer that was a jerk, or whether he was at the wrong place in the wrong time and got caught up in some other offense and ended up serving a sentence. And so those were some of the cases in those early years. And then later, dealing with trafficking cases where the sentencing was much more significant, and people who weren't kingpins certainly had trafficking weight, but were facing inordinate amounts of time, and me being in the position to say, you either have to take this or you're going to go to jail for a long time. And so in retrospect, I view that role very differently, but at the time I felt like I was doing something to help.
I'm going to ask you how you feel looking back on it, but first, like, who was making these charging decisions? Especially starting out in Dorchester, how did you feel like you were making those decisions, or the police were making those decisions, or your supervisors were making those decisions?
Sure, a lot of it happens, especially in district court, right? It's and let's be clear, like over 90% of the cases that are tried in the courts of Massachusetts for criminal matters are district court cases. And so in those cases, it's the police who make the arrest. They go to the clerk's office, fill out an application for a complaint, and then the clerk looks at it and determines if there's probable cause, and then it's brought into the arraignment session. So many days, especially in district court, I would go and pick up a stack of case files, and those were the decisions that were made as far as what cases are going forward. And whether or not to break it down, I had to look to a supervisor as to whether or not it could be broken down to a lesser offense. When I was in Superior Court, I got to decide whether or not I would be charging. But to Professor Ramirez's point about those initial charging decisions, there were a lot of people who could have been charged with simple possession, but were charged with possession with intent to distribute, or people who technically had trafficking weight because it met the minimum threshold. In some instances, the minimum threshold is the equivalent of like 4.5 packs of sugar, but yet that's trafficking weight, and it carries a mandatory minimum sentence. And those decisions are being made by law enforcement. And then when you think about the kind of affinity bias, who's getting charged with those offenses? Overwhelmingly, the people that I saw and prosecuted were Black and brown.
How does that make, how do you feel about that? What lessons do we take from that now? I mean,
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, I think that's why I'm an abolitionist now, is because I see the harm that was done. I see that we can get so much better, we can get so many better outcomes if we make the investment in communities, if we divert people out of the system. I think my brother Abrigal is an exception, right? And he said himself, right? He was smart going in, and he had resources coming out. In that period of self-reflection, he was set up for success. And just because he was successful didn't mean that it was guaranteed he would be successful, because there were a lot of roadblocks. But there's so many people that don't have the things that he have. And when you think about the communities that are over policed and impacted, largely Black and Latinx communities, where there is a dearth of resources invested into addressing people's underlying needs, but there is a surplus of surveillance and policing and interventions into people's lives that pull them into this carceral system, it's hard to justify that. And so looking back on that, I feel like my obligation, based on all that I did, all the people that I sent to jail, all the ways that I perpetuated this system, is to try to dismantle and undo that. And whether it's working in the legislature to advocate for repeals of some of these laws, or pushing and having conversations like this to shift the narrative about what is really needed to address these harms. That's what I feel obliged.
And also, I think you've done a lot of work on bringing to light the role that prosecutors, the importance of the role that prosecutors play in this whole system.
Yeah, I think that's been a key aspect of it. That's our public education campaign around what a difference a district attorney makes, to raise awareness about the role, power, and influence of district attorneys, and how they shape the trajectory of cases within the criminal legal system, how they make decisions. I remember we did an investigation into individuals we believed to be involved in gang activity, and we indicted a bunch of people for marijuana charges. And because of my relationship with community and going to community meetings, I came in feeling like we just did this major sweep and we arrested all these people, and come to find out the people in the community were like, those aren't the people who are the problem. You all wasted all your time and resources, and now you've jammed these people's lives up. But the role of the prosecutor making these charging decisions, using these mandatory minimums to leverage guilty pleas out of these people, and for all of that we did, it didn't have any impact on the violence in the community. And then it further shackled these individuals who were being prosecuted and had them ensnared in this criminal legal system. And those are decisions that prosecutors make.
We're going to come back to everybody and talk about going forward, but I'm going to transition now to Senator Brownsberger. I know we're already getting questions, but we're going to hear from Senator Brownsberger first. Senator William Brownsberger has represented the 2nd Suffolk and Middlesex district since 2012. He is currently the president pro tem of the Massachusetts Senate. was the Senate chair of the Judiciary Committee recently. He was also a practicing criminal defense attorney, including for a time serving weekly in the Dorchester Drug Court. Also at one time was an assistant attorney general in the Massachusetts State Attorney General's office, where he was the deputy chief prosecutor in the Public Protection Bureau and also the chief of asset forfeiture in the narcotics division. Senator, you've been an advocate for criminal justice reform for a long time now. How have these specific laws that we've talked about with some precision, I think, how have they changed since the 1990s, in the early 2000s when we were all doing this work? And first, that's my first question, is how has this changed?
Well, let me say first, back in the day when I was a defense attorney, and I didn't just work in drug court, I took a lot of the regular cases, and I had the pleasure of working with Rahsaan, on the opposite side of those cases, and working in front of you, and you're two of the people that I respect most out of the many years that the many people that I worked with through those years. So it's a pleasure to be on this.
Dorchester. This all is quite the Dorchester reunion, but that's go ahead. It's an honor.
It's an honor to be on the panel with all of you, and so I. Let me just offer a little context and how I see us just trying to look forward from here. I mean, if you think about it, we're really in, I don't want to use the word pendulum because I like to believe that the arc of history bends toward justice. And I think that hopefully we are moving in that direction, but there are parts of this that swing a little bit, because if you go back to the mid 60s, there were people that were talking about prison abolition and, at a serious level. And then there was a crime wave, and there was all the things that happened in the late 60s, and there was Richard Nixon, and the whole national consciousness just shifted into a tough on crime mentality. And I guess one thing I want to say is that I really believe that is a consciousness thing that reflects itself in millions of decisions by police officers, decisions by prosecutors, decisions by judges, and decisions by legislators are only a part of that picture. I spent some time just going through all the mandatory minimums that we passed from the 70s, 80s, and most of them in the 70s, 80s, early 90s, and start trying to attach them to changes in levels of incarceration. But really, most of the mandatory minimums, that's not what happened. It was really judges, prosecutors, as you say, what a difference a prosecutor makes. That we're making those decisions, because the drug mandatories, there was never more than 25% of the people who were in prison were there for drug offenses at the state level. People hear national statistics about the high level of drug offenders in the federal system, but most people who are incarcerated are incarcerated in the state system, and most people who are incarcerated in the state system are incarcerated for non-drug offenses. But from that period, from 1974 to 1992, everywhere in the country, incarceration went up by a factor of 4 to 5-fold, and in some places like 6 or 7-fold. And there was just all these different decisions being made that were by a tough on crime consciousness. And the seeds of change were being planted as all that was happening. And you had the sentencing reform law that was pushed for by the Boston Bar Association in the mid 90s. And people tried to look at sentencing reform. The legislature was not ready for that. And that thing went no place. But because they had just gone through passing the school zone in 1989, and the other penalty enhancements in the late 80s. But it took until 2012. It took changes in the world, I think, where crime sort of, for reasons that a lot of people debate and nobody really understands fully, started to back off. A lot of things started to settle down, and the consciousness changed. And so that I think prosecutors are making different decisions. Judges have been making different decisions. Finally, the legislature was ready to make different decisions. We repealed some of the school zone of the laws in 2012. But that was, by the way, what we did in 2012 was a mixed bag, because at the same time, the legislature increased the 3 strikes and you're out dynamic, the rules of that. 2014, we made some changes. And finally, in 2018, we really, did as much as I think we can really do in this legislature, was we got rid of all, effectively got rid of all the retailing mandatories. We didn't get rid of the weight mandatories. That was not possible from a political standpoint. We got rid of all the retailing mandatories except for second offense heroin, and people were still, very worked up about the opiates. So I think there's we've gone through a shift of and by the way, the prison population in Massachusetts is down dramatically from a high of something like 12,000. We're down, I believe we're into the sixes now. I mean, so we've come down enormously, and that reflects a whole lot of things. Sixes, low sevens. It's just an enormous swing that we've had, and it's due to a whole lot of different things happening at once. You look like you're trying to frame another question, Judge. No?
I was going to say one suggestion for the drop is demographics, just that the shrinking number of young people has affected the crime rate. And I mean, that's what we thought in the 90s was the numbers go down. The numbers of people under 30 went down, since that tends to commit crimes. But
so
I don't
there's
know
no question.
Think of that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I have a full evaluation of that. I'm sure that's part of it. I also just think people are doing things a little differently. But I think that I think things are happening in the world where crime is actually a little bit less, and maybe it's the demographics, but it's also maybe decisions that kids are making too. But I think that there's no question that the incarceration impact of the war on drugs definitely fell most heavily on people of color, but it's also as I think a couple of people recognize already, so did the collateral effects. I mean, the open air drug markets. I mean, those were things that were happening in neighborhoods that people wanted addressed. And the good thing is that the open air drug markets have calmed down, to a considerable degree, right? I mean, they've sort of gone underground. People have beepers. It's quieter. You don't have the stuff going on as much on the street. So the sort of fights for corners and the drugs and guns problems that you had in the early 90s have sort of changed a little bit. You still have a problem of violence, that disproportionately affects young men of color in a few neighborhoods, right? And if we believe that Black Lives Matter, we have to talk about that problem and we have to deal with that problem. And I think the whole talk about, the whole law enforcement focus on drug enforcement per se has been a distraction from the role of, of good policing, which is to keep feuds among young men from spinning out of control. I mean, this is the role of law enforcement in all times and in all places has to a large degree been controlling the testosterone problem. I mean, it goes back, to a whole lot of different times and places. And it's not about, black or white. It's about young men getting into bad modes of interacting. And we've often said that we can't arrest our way out of the drug problem. I also think we can't really arrest our way out of the violence problem either. That law enforcement becomes just one more weapon to be turned against an opponent for snitching, selectively, one more reason to engage in violence if someone believes that they've been snitched upon. So law enforcement can get played, and we really need to, look at what are the alternative ways that we can help kids get out of trouble. I'm not a defund the police person. I do believe we will always need brave women and men who are sworn to enforce order. And I think, by the way, what we did in 2020 with the help of Rahsaan and others, I think we have a great reform package. It's a reform package only, but it is a great reform package that increases accountability. And I think it's going to make all the difference in the quality of policing over the next 5 or 10 years. But policing is not enough of a solution itself. We need to start thinking about, how can we do more to support people like Mr. Forrester and his organization who are trying to help kids, get out of trouble, find themselves on a different path. And it has to be peer mentoring. It can't be coming through law enforcement. It can't be, the gang officer, that's going to talk back to the police, because there's a trust thing, right? I mean, if you're a kid in trouble, you're not going to be talking to the police. You're just not going to be doing that. In fact, you'd probably be crazy to do that because you're going to get yourself killed. You have to, it has to be peer mentoring. It has to be peer intervention. And we have to keep talking. We have to be doing more of that, more of the kind of things that Mr. Forrester is doing. And we also, have to keep ourselves focused on the basics: jobs, education, housing. And we just need to think of young men in, the whole sort of word gang is basically a pejorative word. And we just have to think about kids in trouble who have gotten, pulled into situations where they feel like they have to fight with each other. And I think there's a lot of recognition of these needs. And I'm hopeful that over the next few years, we in the legislature, will join forces with a lot of people out in the community and try to do a better job looking at these alternative ways to help people.
We do have questions, and I promised we would get to some of them. I know we're going to try to talk about going forward, but I think that's a good way to start. Adam Tomasi has asked that wouldn't the judges, if there weren't mandatory minimums, wouldn't the judges' racial biases account for the same kind of the same kind of different results that we saw with the charging decisions? And I'm going to throw that out there. I don't know who would like to. Professor Ramirez, would you like to take a run at that briefly? We get several questions anyway, so.
I think the mandatory minimums are one size fits all, and what the judges want is evidence-based sentencing. They want to look at the prior criminal record. So someone like Mr. Forrester, who is 20 years old with no priors, would be a candidate for probation as opposed to a 10-year sentence. They want to look at role in the offense. Is this a courier or is this a drug kingpin? They want to look at the quantity of the narcotics as well as the quality. And they think that that will, with guidelines, and we don't have mandatory guidelines, but we do have sentencing guidelines to help the judges, will create a fairer sentence. And I also just wanted to say one thing, which is this. We talked about the Harvard report earlier, and Ralph read that report before he died and concluded that it was what he suspected, that the mandatory minimums accounted for a significant amount of the racial disparities in the system today. And he wrote about it in the Boston Bar Journal. And because this is the last thing that he wrote before he died, I'm going to quote it. The good news is that the legislature can greatly diminish the racial disparity in the length of sentences by abolishing mandatory minimum sentences in firearm and drug cases, and for those with prior firearm and drug convictions or juvenile adjudication. His last words of advice for all of us was this: if you want to reduce racial disparities in the Massachusetts system today, you need to abolish the mandatory minimum sentences.
Let me just say one thing, just as a judge. My view was always that if I have racial, and I think we all have implicit bias, that if I'm sentencing one group disproportionately or showing affinity bias, I do it in open court. The judges do it in open court, and there are court watches where people can sit and take notes and write down. We did that for domestic violence. They've done that on other things. Whereas and I think Mr. Hall will back me up, the charging decisions are made out of the public eye. That's what they're not something nobody keeps track of. Kind of work that Professor Ramirez's students did, where you can look at the police report. That was an extraordinary opportunity given the clerk of the Dorchester Court, Dwyer, who was willing to permit that. Nobody permits that level of scrutiny. Just my view on that one. The second question we have is for Mr. Hall, which is, I think that's 7 o'clock. You said, please, the Ms. Marianne Reynolds said, please elaborate on discerning community needs.
Yeah, and I think Senator Brownsberger touched on this a little bit, but it's, what are the underlying needs that lead to people being involved in the criminal legal system? There's undiagnosed and untreated trauma, there's poverty, there's insecure housing, there's substandard education that a lot of people receive, and then there's the issue of over-policing that happens. I think Senator Brownsberger was right on point to address the dealing with toxic masculinity and the problem of young men, and also correct to say that the solution is not coming from police. There's ample research and evidence that shows non-police violence interruptions interrupter or intervention programs have a significant impact on reducing incidents of crime. Investments in student summer employment opportunities have a correlation to reductions in youth arrests. When you look at some of the information, Mass Inc. did a study several years ago that looked at the geography of incarceration in Suffolk County in particular, and it showed that in certain neighborhoods, Codman Square, Fields Corner, Franklin Field, that like 50% of the homes had someone who was either waiting, who was either incarcerated or returning from incarceration. That's every other house. And so when you think of the level of money, the amount of money that is spent on housing those individuals, as opposed to educating, treating mental health issues, substance use disorders, housing insecurity, if we would shift that, we would get better outcomes. And it's not going to happen overnight, but we need to continue to make those investments. And so taking it from the people who are directly impacted, formerly incarcerated people, people living in those communities, mothers who have lost loved ones, but also have young people who are caught up in the system as well. Those are the voices that we need to be listening to discern what the community needs are.
Judge Hanlon, if I'm,
of course, please.
I was just going to say, if I may just go back to the, how do you prevent the sort of like the lack of discretion in judges? I think like one of the things that I found that is important is the accountability factor, right? So we're constantly having these conversations about systems of racism, institutions that are biased. But the thing that actually plays the role in allowing for that bias to continue to exist is that there aren't accountabilities in place. And I think like one of the things that ends up happening as well is that like when we do these large scale sort of like analysis of like disparities in systems, they happen like 5, 10, 15 years out. By that time, people have already fell by the wayside in these disparities and suffered more trauma. And so I think the question becomes, how do we make sure, if it's like an annual or biannual basis, these systems that we know disparities exist in, such as the judicial system, are actually being analyzed and assessed so that judges, those who sit in the seats of power and control, can actually have an opportunity to reflect on how they're making decisions within those systems. So I think that accountability factor is critical to actually holding those who sit in seats of power accountable in these systems as well. I think the other piece to Rahsaan Hall's point about like the 50% of homes, in these communities is that we also have to understand that that's more trauma coming back into the communities that's actually creating further problems, right? Because you have a psychosis now that's coming back into the community. And this violence that we see now, as we understand it from young people and understand the social dynamics, a lot of it is about values and beliefs. It's not even about making money. It's not even about like what it was in the 80s and 90s. It's now sort of like sad to say, somewhat of a culture of violence and a lack of understanding how to address conflict and have conflict resolution. So this is why the work that we do at Teen Empowerment is so critical, because we try to get young people in a space where they start to think about what they're thinking about, and then become peer ambassadors and have conversations about how they're thinking about this conflict, how they can prevent themselves, and why living is more important than dying.
So we have one more question. I'm being told we could get time for one more question. I'm thinking I might throw this at you, Senator Brownsberger, but you feel free to pass on this, all right? It's something that's in the discussion a lot, I think, in the general discussion these days, only because I think you've had less time to talk. So if you don't want to contribute, you may. But Alan Wyman has asked, how much influence do police unions in Massachusetts have over this kind of police operations? And how much political influence do they have? And would they block money and resources being directed to other community resources?
Well, look, I think I think that police unions do the job that other unions do, right? Which is that they advocate for their members, and that's what unions are supposed to do. And so they're going to, the primary concerns are pay and conditions of work, and protecting officers from arbitrary discipline, which is always the role of unions, and that's a legitimate role. I will say that our police reform does allow as a separate channel, and unions cannot block the decertification of a police officer for misconduct by our new post commission, and that's a very important thing. But I don't really feel that the unions are going to have a huge role in decision making about investments in alternatives to reducing violence. And I think that probably, I think it's not their direct concern, because I don't think in practice, I mean, you often hear this conversation, well, why don't you just take the money out of the state police budget and put it into the, human service budget? Well, it just doesn't work that way in practice. I mean, it's not so you move money from here to there. You have a structure, you deal with it, you negotiate it to the right level. So the decisions that we're going to make about trying to invest in, all the other good things we want to do, jobs, education, housing, and as well as things like community intervention, supporting community-led organizations, supporting peer mentoring, the kinds of things that really can maybe make a big difference in an individual's life. I don't think that's a direct competition with what the police are going to do, and I don't think it's something that police unions are going to fight or block or have the ability to fight or block.
And are you optimistic going forward that we can make things at least a little bit better?
I certainly hope so. I think we got to, if you're asking me, I mean, I think the reforms we've done on the policing side are going to be good. I think they're going to make a difference. And I think we have a whole lot of more work to do. But the good news is I think we have a whole lot of will to do it. And I think there's a whole lot of great people out in the community, in the organizations like Rahsaan's organization, kind of work that Mr. Forrester is doing. There's a lot of good people trying to do things in the community. I think if we keep working together, I'm really actually pretty hopeful about the next 10 years.
Well, can I just tell you, thank you all, everyone who participated, Professor, Mr. Forrester, Rahsaan, Mr. Hall, Mr. Brownsberger. It has been really a privilege to get to be a part of this discussion. And I'm going to turn it back over to the Massachusetts Historical Society.
Yeah, I just want to say the kind of work that Deborah Ramirez is doing too. I mean, she doesn't just do this research work. She's also doing some very hands-on stuff, to help people in the community that I think is also extremely positive. So she's part of that effort too.
Recruited hundreds of people to work on criminal justice issues of fairness and reform, not only around race, but on other issues. I speak from personal experience, but so do many other people.
Well, I just wanted to thank all of you for participating. This was really a very interesting and enlightening conversation. And I'd like to thank all of our audience members for attending. And I hope everyone has a chance to go outside and enjoy some of the nice weather, because this is the best time of year to be outside. So. And I think that will be about the end of the program. So also, if people missed any of our past programs, we have been recording these and they will all be up at our website with masshist.org/confronting racial injustice. Thank you all and have a wonderful evening.